Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of my podcast, Morgan Le Fay, Chivalry's Hidden Threat. My name is Annie Blevins, and today we are going to be analyzing the medieval poem, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, focusing on the reversal of gender roles that we see within this poem, and specifically the role of the character Morgan Le Fay and her significance in this poem. So we'll start with a brief summary and just some information about this poem. So Sir Gawain and the Green Knight was written by an unknown author who's often referred to as the Gawain poet or the Pearl poet because this is kind of the best known work by them. It was written in the late 14th century, so during the medieval period, and the poem is written in alliterative verse, and it is 2,530 lines long. So it's a very lengthy poem, so you could probably think about it more like what we would think of a short story rather than a poem, but it is technically a poem. So the basic plot of the poem, because I know it's not one that people are super familiar with, is that our main character, Gawain, he's also sometimes called Gawain, but I refer to him as Gawain. There's not really one correct way. I just prefer Gawain. So Gawain is a young knight in King Arthur's court in Camelot that wants to prove himself as a loyal, devoted, worthy knight to King Arthur. So our poem begins during a meeting with King Arthur at the Round Table with all of his knights, and during the meeting, this man, known as the Green Knight, comes in uninvited and begins to threaten King Arthur and his knights, and he demands that one of King Arthur's knights battle him to prove that King Arthur's court is worthy of all of the power it holds. So Gawain, being a young knight that wants to prove himself, volunteers himself, and he actually beheads the Green Knight right there in front of everyone, but it does not kill him. Instead, the Green Knight, tells Gawain to meet him at this place called the Green Chapel at the beginning of the new year and prepare to battle him properly. Then he leaves without a head. After this happens, everyone at the Round Table is kind of left in shock at how could this man survive this and what are we going to do now? But they know that Gawain has to battle this man like he said he was going to. So Gawain trains for battle and he finally goes off on this long adventure to find the Green Chapel. And on his way, he stumbles upon this castle owned by a Lord Bertilac and his wife, Lady Bertilac, and they invite him to stay in their home to rest for a few days before his big battle. While he's there, he befriends Lord Bertilac, but Lady Bertilac repeatedly tries to sexually tempt Gawain while her husband is out hunting. Gawain resists initially, but after enough advances, she's eventually successful, and as a parting gift after their final intimate moment together, she leaves him with her own green girdle to wear as he leaves for battle. When he arrives at the Green Chapel to battle the Green Knight notices the green girdle and reveals that he was actually acting as Lord Bertilac the entire time, knowing that Gawain would fall for the temptation of the lady, as proved by the green girdle that he's wearing. So we see here that the Green Knight and Lord Bertilac are the same person. In this same moment, the Green Knight, or Lord Bertilac, reveals that an evil sorceress, Morgan Le Fay, has actually been the instigator and planner of this entire adventure. She sent the Green Knight to Arthur's court on the first day and has been controlling and leading him and the Lady Bertilac ever since. So she literally planned this entire thing. So at the end of the story, the Green Knight and Gawain never fully battle. Instead, they form an alliance, and Gawain returns to Arthur's court ashamed because he allowed himself to fall victim to Morgan's schemes, which proves he is unworthy as a knight, and in turn that King Arthur's court is unworthy of their power, because that's the entire point of why he was battling, was to prove that King Arthur's court is worthy. So before we start our analysis here, let's define some important things that we're going to be discussing, and that is the ideals of knighthood and chivalry. So when we think of knighthood or chivalry, we probably think of ideals like honor, courage, loyalty to one's group, all of those types of things. But another important aspect of chivalry and King Arthur's knighthood specifically is the protection of the weak and defenseless. So knights are expected to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And in these stories, these medieval stories, or any stories that really involve these knighthood or these masculine heroes, who's often portrayed as the weak and defenseless? it often ends up being a female character. So these knights are expected to protect women at all costs. So now that we're considering that, let's analyze some important things going on with gender throughout this poem. Many scholars have argued that Morgan's delayed revelation in this poem, how she wasn't mentioned until the very end of the poem, actually overshadows her power and control over the narrative, which they believe is an attempt to obscure the fact that a female figure is responsible for defaming knighthood. I add to this argument that this obscurity is necessary to hide the reality of the weakness of knighthood and patriarchal dominance, because both rely on women to be able to perform their duties. Because Morgan is the puppet master of this entire scheme, this entire threat to knighthood and chivalry, it symbolizes the real threat to King Arthur's court, knighthood, chivalry, and male power in patriarchal societies, which is women. So let's start by analyzing some important things going on in this poem, and we will do that by beginning with this concept of the beheading game and Lady Bertilac's sexual temptation in this story. So we'll start with the beheading game. So what is a beheading game? Well, that is a common trope in medieval literature, and it's usually a throwdown of the masculine elite. So it's usually two male characters battling to behead one another, and the one who wins is obviously the one who has proven himself more chivalrous, more powerful, and now all the other male characters who see him win this battle now respect him, and that is that. So that's obviously what we see going on here between Gawain and the Green Knight, where this entire story is leading up to their huge battle at the end, where one of them is going to behead the other and become victorious. But what we see here is this interesting mockery of a beheading game going on, because, as it's revealed at the end of the story, Morgan controls the entire plot and therefore makes this beheading game useless, which makes her the audience of this beheading game. So Morgan knows, as she's controlled this entire story, that this beheading game that Gawain is preparing himself for is not real. She's making sort of this mockery of it. She knows that in the end, it's not going to matter at all, because she's going to make Gawain fail in other ends, in other ways, other forms. So this beheading game at the end is going to be useless, but Gawain never even realizes that. So for Morgan, despite being a female character, someone who would typically support the masculine elite, she's mocking these actions, this beheading game, this battle, which is seen as highly respectable in their field. And this mockery reveals that without women to be their audience, because what are these men fighting for? They're fighting for the defenseless, the protection of the defenseless, which is women. So without women to be the audience of these battles and these games, or the humble acceptors of these chivalrous acts, the Knights of the Round Table really don't have a reason to exist with such elite power and respect that they have at this time. So this is one way, this is one of the first ways we see where Morgan has kind of turned the tables on these ideals of knighthood and said, what are we really doing here? What's really the point of any of this? So now let's talk about Lady Bertilac's sexual temptation and these reversal of gender roles we see between her and Gawain. So Lady Bertilac, if you remember, is Lord Bertilac's wife who sexually tempts Gawain in the castle. And as is revealed at the end of the story, Morgan is also controlling her. So everything Lady Bertilac is doing is under the control of Morgan. Morgan is planning this entire thing. It's implied that, she's kind of the one telling Lady Bertilac what to do here. So anything Lady Bertilac is doing here, let's also think of it in the same lens as like Morgan is also kind of doing this. So the lady's temptation scenes are strategically paralleled with Lord Bertilac's hunting scenes. So anytime we have a scene where the lady is sexually tempting Gawain, we have a scene right next to it in the poem, mirroring it, where Lord Bertilac is hunting a fox. And the rhetoric in these two differing scenes are really similar in really interesting ways, in ways that I think reveal this sort of switch of gender roles that we have between Lady Bertilac and Gawain. So Lady Bertilac takes on more of a masculine role here, while Gawain remains sort of this more feminine role. So Lady Bertilac is the one in power here. She is the one that's essentially hunting Gawain in a way. So at the end of each scene, both Lady Bertilac and Lord Bertilac actually take home their prized possessions. And so what do we mean by prized possessions? Well, Lord Bertilac successfully kills the fox that he has been hunting for so long at the end of his final hunting scene. And Lady Bertilac successfully tempts Gawain, and which I believe, if we think about it in this way, where we're comparing Gawain and this fox, we're kind of objectifying Gawain in a way, making him a prize to be won rather than the one competing in the game. So let's consider, how does the lady successfully tempt Gawain? Well, she uses ideals of knighthood and chivalry against Gawain in this really interesting way, because every time the lady tries to tempt Gawain, initially, his response is he will not, because it would be disloyal to his friend Lord Bertilac. But in this final scene, Lady Bertilac actually points out, well, knights are expected to be chivalrous towards women, so you actually have a duty as a man, as a knight, to care for me in whatever way I feel is necessary, in whatever way I need. So with this statement, Gawain believes he's put in this hard place. He's put in this difficult position where if he denies the lady, he's acting against his chivalrous duty of sort of taking care of women, pleasing women in whatever way they need. But if he does fall for this sexual temptation, he's being disloyal to his friend, Lord Bertilac, which is also against his expectations of a knight. So Gawain eventually does fall for the lady's temptations, and she successfully gives him her green girdle, which becomes how he is revealed at the end as having failed whenever the Green Knight sees the green girdle. So let's keep in mind, once again, that Morgan Le Fay is controlling this entire plot. So if Morgan Le Fay is the puppet master of all of this, if Morgan Le Fay is the one that's causing all of these reversal of gender roles, all of these failures on Gawain, why is she barely mentioned in the story? So Morgan's name is not mentioned in the poem until line 2,446. There are 2,530 lines in the poem, so she's not mentioned until the last 100 lines or so of this poem, even though she's literally the one who caused every single thing in this poem. I believe that if the author had introduced Morgan as the instigator at the beginning of the story, she would have served an entirely different purpose, because she would have signaled to readers from the beginning that the errors of knighthood and chivalry were the main themes here. But because we don't hear anything about Morgan, we think that throughout this entire poem, we're reading another story about a brave knight who's going out and battling. So it feels like just another story where this knight's training, he's going to go out and battle and come back victorious and prove once again how chivalrous King Arthur's knights are. But by veiling Morgan until the end of the story, we have strategically revealed knighthood's greatest flaw, and that is that they do not realize their own chivalrous expectations of themselves are weaknesses and unrealistic in themselves. So, we see this through how Morgan uses ideals of chivalry to combat Gawain and reveal the flaws of knighthood throughout the entire story. So, this is seen through the mockery of the beheading game, where she says, she's kind of implying, what's the point of this beheading game? Look, you've been fighting for this all along, and it's led up to nothing. And the sexual temptation of Lady Bertilac, where she literally uses this ideal of protecting women against Gawain himself, and showing that when you idolize these ideas of chivalry so highly, it's going to put anyone in these difficult positions. So she's actually revealing that it's unfair for not only women in this patriarchal society to be expected to sort of bow down, allow men to take care of them. It's also bad for men as well, because they're put in these difficult positions where there's nothing they could do correctly. So, but an interesting part of this is that Morgan is vilified in this story whenever Gawain or King Arthur could have considered her actions as a way to improve chivalry. They could have simply taken what she showed them as a way to improve upon themselves, but instead, Gawain vilifies Morgan for her manipulation of the scheme, not only for the way it threatened him, but also for the fact that it threatened the dependability of knighthood. So, at the end of the story, Gawain responds pretty vigorously to this threat, because he realizes that knighthood is an institution which relies on society, particularly women's society, unquestioning loyalty to it. And when society gives women like Morgan Le Fay enough power to call attention to flaws in male-dominated knighthood and chivalry, it is much more likely to destroy that basis of society by redirecting one of its principal groups, women. So Morgan has revealed here, you guys have been ignoring this equality that women deserve, and now look where it's gotten you. I've been hidden in the background of the scheme this entire time because you never thought that I, as a woman, could be capable of planning something like this. But now she reveals at the end that she's been hidden the entire time, and it actually angers Gawain and King Arthur's court more. And at the end of the story, they really don't seem to learn much from this at all. Morgan just seems to be a vilified character, and they go back to living essentially the same way they did before. But why is this important? What's the sort of takeaway we can take from here? What's the point of analyzing a character, Morgan Le Fay, like this? What's the point of sort of conducting this literary research on Morgan Le Fay and these gender reversal roles in poems like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight? Well, I believe it's important to consider how literature, art, and anything we create really reflects real-life issues at the time that they're created, and how those real-life issues last throughout centuries. So Morgan, at the time this was written, was a rare, powerful female figure in a patriarchal society, just as many female figures are in things we still read today. So I encourage you to go read or listen to other works of literature and consider how they reflect societal issues occurring at the time they were written, and how you can even think about how they apply to today, even if they are written through fictional works like this one. So, though Morgan Le Fay is a fictional sorceress, her place in this poem and many others reveal many things about the power and importance of women and equality in our world then and today. So, thank you so much for listening. This has been Morgan Le Fay, Chivalry's Hidden Threat.